All right, folks, let's move on to page 2 of our notes on analyzing categorical data, and we're going to start off with a couple definitions. Two-way table is a table of counts that organizes data about two categorical variables. So with a two-way table, we are analyzing two categorical variables. Marginal distribution of one of the categorical variables in a two-way table of counts is the distribution of values of that variable among all individuals described by the table. So these next two definitions here, marginal and conditional distribution, I think the easiest way to illustrate those is kind of to just highlight the table a little bit. So with a marginal distribution, we're looking at things out in the margins. The dogs are very excited about marginal distributions. And we're back. Okay, so yeah, marginal distribution is when we start to look at percents out in the margins of the table. And conditional distribution, and the definition is kind of hard to understand when you just read it. Conditional distribution of a variable describes the values of that variable among individuals who have a specific value of another variable. There's a separate conditional distribution for each value of the other variable. So conditional distribution is we start to look at percents within the table. So I might look at the percent of each of these values with respect to 517. Or I might look at the percent of each of these values with respect to 467. Again, that's the difference between marginal distribution and conditional distribution. I'm going to kind of erase these highlights because I don't need them right now. Okay, we'll be doing other stuff with that table. Okay, last but not least, we're going to talk about association. We say that there is an association between two variables if knowing the value of one variable helps predict the value of the other. If knowing the value of one variable does not help you predict the value of the other, then there is no association between the variables. Okay, so that's a term that we're going to use throughout the year, and we'll be adding a lot more detail to it in terms of how we can predict one value if we know another. Okay, so that's a little bit of foreshadowing. Okay, let's get going here. First example, cell phones. In 2013, the Pew Research Center asked a random sample of 2024 adult cell phone users from the United States which type of cell phone they own, an iPhone, an Android, or something other, which includes non-smartphones. Here are the results broken down by age category. So we have an age category of 18 to 34-year-olds, and I like to do this just for this example because I want to kind of see how the age groups are broken up, but that's an age gap of 17 years. And then we have 35 to 54-year-olds, and that's 20 years. And then 55 plus, so who knows, that's 30 plus years of adults that are using cell phones. So the first question here asks for, and again, this is a two-way table. We have two different categorical variables. We have type of cell phone, and then we have age group. Now, age is typically a quantitative variable, but here we're looking at it as a categorical variable because it's an age range. Okay, use the cell phone data to calculate the marginal distribution in percents of type of cell phone. So that is pretty straightforward. We're going to do that over here because we're asked to do the marginal distribution in percents of type of cell phone. So that's only the margin out here. So I basically take each of these numbers as a percent of 2024. So 467 out of 2024 is 23.1%. And 503 out of 2024 is 24.9%. 1054 out of 2024 is 52.1%. Struggle there with the decimal. Hold on. 52.1%. Okay, and that's it. That's the marginal distribution for type of cell phone. The real quick note here. Okay, so these values do not add up to 100%. They should, because that would be the total of the 2024 random adult cell phone users. So why don't they add up to 100%? Well, it's due to something we call round-off error. Because each of those percents we rounded to the nearest tenth of a percent, we've done some rounding there in that tenth of a percent digit that has caused the total to not add up to 100. It better add up to pretty close to 100, otherwise we made a big mistake. Okay, so now let's take a look at part B here. It says make a graph to display the marginal distribution, describe what you see. So I'm just gonna quickly sketch out a graph here. It's not gonna be real exact, and then we'll talk about what we see. All right, folks, as I'm making this graph, I realized something that I could have done a better job of. I only go up to 52.1%, but I made my graph go all the way up to 100. So I'm going to change my scale here to kind of give us, we're going to fill the graph space. So I'm going to go ahead and change the scale. Okay, there we go. Quick graph of the marginal distribution. Again, I sketched it. It's approximately to scale. I'm pretty good at drawing things to scale by hand. You might need a straight edge perhaps to help you make it a little bit closer to scale than what I did. So let's talk about what we see here. First observation I make is the following. Okay, my conclusion there is that the percent who own iPhones and Androids are about equal. We can see that they're right in there around that 25%, 23.1 and 24.9. And then more than half of cell phone owners own some other type of cell phone. And I think that's worth discussing. Okay, so worth discussing here. I know if you think about the cell phone you use, and we see this data where more than half of all cell phones are something other than an Android or an iPhone. We have to remember when this data was taken. This data was recorded in 2013. And we also look at 2024 adult cell phone users, and they were randomly chosen. So we ended up with 517 of those in this young age group, and then 637 in this middle age group, and then 870 in this larger age group. Well, why are there more here than here? Well, look at the number of years for each of those categories. So this 55 and over group is a larger population than the 18 to 34 group, just because it covers more years. So I find that kind of interesting, because think about, again, your cell phone use versus maybe your parents' or your grandparents' cell phone use, and how maybe that has changed since 2013. Okay, again, this example illustrated the idea of a marginal distribution. So now we're going to go and look at another example. We're going to look at cell phones again. Based on the cell phone data from the previous example, is there evidence of a difference in the distribution of cell phone ownership for the three age groups? And then we're going to justify your answer. By the way, I'm a big proponent of these three words right here, justify your answer. In every math class I've ever taught, I think that's important. In fact, I think that's important anywhere. You know, I once had a guy that I worked for. He said, no matter what job you have in your life, you're going to be a sales rep, because you're trying to sell your ideas to other people. And that's all about justifying your answer. So there's your little life lesson for today. Now let's move on to this example. So we're gonna analyze the distribution by looking at a conditional distribution of cell phone type by age group. So that means I'm going to look at the distribution of cell phone type for each of the different age groups, and that's going to be a conditional distribution. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the percents down the column. So I'm going to lock the age group and then look at the percent of iPhone users in the young group, percent of Android, percent of other, etc. And I'm going to do that for each of the different age categories. Now, those are easy to calculate, those percentages. I'm just going to do 169 divided by 517, 214 divided by 517, etc., etc. I'm going to do that across the three different categories. I'm going to round those to the nearest whole percent. And I'm just going to fill those out now. You can just test the calculations, make sure you can get the same numbers I do. And again, I'm going to round to the nearest whole percent just because it's going to make it easier for us to analyze the data. Okay, so there is our conditional distribution of cell phone by age group. So again, percents going down the columns. Now let's analyze those. And one of the first things to do to analyze a distribution is to graph it. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a graph here, and a graph of those calculations that I just did. Okay, the graph that I'm going to do is going to be called a segmented bar graph. I'm going to write that over here in the margin. I think you'll see when we're done with this example that a segmented bar graph is kind of a cool way to analyze a distribution. But I will tell you, it is not tested on the AP exam. So it is not tested on the AP statistics exam, but we'll use it here just because it's kind of cool. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark off the percent of. Now let me change my approach here. I'm gonna make a key first. So in my distribution, I had iPhones, I had Androids, and then we had other. Now, for each of the age categories, I'm going to graph 100% of the distribution. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to break that 100% into each of the three categories. So I'm going to graph iPhone as blue, Android as red, other. So let's go back up and look at that 18 to 34 age group. iPhone was 33%, other was 26%, and Android was 41% in the middle. So I'm going to start by marking off 26% for other. There's my 26% for other. And I had 33% at the top for iPhone, so that's going to be, let's see, 10, 20, 30, and a little more. 10, 20, 30, and a little more. And then everything in the middle is going to be the Android category. And I'm going to do that for each of the conditional distributions by age group. Now for the color coding. Okay, so what does the picture tell us? Well, you've probably heard me say this before. Picture's worth 1,000 words, and this is what jumps out at me when I take a look at this picture. So a couple different conclusions we could say here. First of all, in that 18 to 34 age group, the distribution is pretty even between the three different types. I mean, iPhone and Android are larger than other, but they're fairly equal. And then we start to spread out as we get into that middle age category where Android is, the other category is growing. And then finally, in this final category where the old folks are primarily using other cell phones. So, the conditional distribution shows us that there is an association between age and cell phone ownership. The older a cell phone user is, the more likely they are to not use an Android or an iPhone. You can kind of see that that shift in the distribution as you move across the different age categories. And if you're, I think back to in whatever year this data was, let's take a look. In 2013, I think my dad was still using a Microsoft phone, or a Windows phone. Who uses those anymore? They don't even exist, I don't think. But anyway, so again, back in 2013, this is what the distribution looked like based on the study from the Pew Research Center. Okay, I have one last question before we end this video, and I think I've copied it down here. So the question is, what would the conditional distribution of age group by cell phone type tell us? Let's go back up and look. So these percents here down the columns, that's the conditional distribution of phone by age group. But what if we looked at the conditional distribution of age group by phone type? So that would be looking across this way. So for example, I would take 169 as a percent of 467. And that happens to be, you don't have to write this in, folks. I'm just kind of illustrating an example here. That would be 36%. That would be 36%. And if we looked at the number of iPhones in the 35 to 54 category, 171 out of 467 is about 37%. And finally, the last category, 127 out of 467, is about 27%. So again, I'm just illustrating here that the conditional distribution can be either up and down the table or left and right across the table. And this one just tells us that of all the iPhones that were captured in this survey, 36% of them were in the younger age category, 37% in the middle age category, and only 27% in the oldest category. Again, just another conditional distribution. And what you have to be careful of when you're asked to put together a conditional distribution is this language right here. So the conditional distribution of cell phone type by age group meant that we were going down the columns. The conditional distribution of age group by cell phone type meant that we were going across the table. And that's it for this video. Good luck, folks.